Man hiking trail calls out for his daughter, but a different voice calls back. To avoid tragedy on the hiking trail, follow this simple rule. Stick together at all times. Trails can go from safe to deadly in a matter of seconds when groups split apart. John Utzi's heart sank when he realized his two children, who he'd just been hiking with, disappeared from sight. But when he called out his daughter's name and heard a man's voice in response, John was thrown into action. Sometimes the most experienced hikers are the ones who make the simplest mistakes. For the Utzi family, this hike was no different than the hundreds they'd taken before. They were overconfident, leading to a series of events John would never forget. The Utzi family was exploring the beautiful Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico. Their path, called the Windsor Trail, had already seen thousands of families stroll through that summer. However, there was one part of the trail hikers were cautioned to avoid: the highest peak. Towering above the Utzi family was the trail's high point of 11,000 feet, the length of over 36 football fields. Even the lowest part of the trail comes in at a whopping 7,000 feet high, but John and his kids, unaware of the nightmare to come, weren't intimidated by these staggering numbers. John was admiring the views as his kids played ahead of him. They'd passed a few families along the way, indicating this was a safe space for children to run wild. With summer coming to a close, John was soaking up every moment. Suddenly, he could no longer hear his kids' voices. At first, John wasn't concerned. This wasn't the first time he trusted his kids to roam free. After all, they had all the survival gear that they could carry. Little did they know, these supplies would soon be urgently needed. As a veteran of the Marine Corps, John was confident in his children's survival instincts. On top of their hiking experience, his kids had been raised by a service member. Their ability to run into an emergency situation was about to be tested. After a long silence, John called out to his kids. He knew his 10-year-old would be following close behind his 12-year-old big sister. But at the top of the path, which was growing steeper and steeper, John only saw one of his children. Once John caught up to his youngest child, he realized his eldest daughter had disappeared. The two began searching for her, staying close together as they barreled over the dirt and rocks. Clearly, this part of the trail was less traveled. Reminding John of the park's deadly warnings, now his mind was racing. John's guilt was settling in. If he'd only told his kids to stay close, his daughter would be safe and sound. If anything were to happen to her, John would be absolutely devastated. Even his 10-year-old was growing fearful. They yelled and yelled until finally they got an unexpected response. John thought he heard his daughter yelling, so he shouted her name as loudly as he could. Suddenly, a deep voice cut through the trees, giving John a scare. Realizing it was a man's voice, John bolted ahead. John's dash toward the strange man's voice felt like it would never end. Time slowed down as his brain cycled through worst-case scenarios. When he heard his daughter's voice yell out again, John nearly tripped over his own feet. Finally, he reached the path's end, in shock by what he found. After expecting something horrific, John was relieved to discover his daughter in one piece. They embraced, but her face was heavy with concern. Before John could ask why, he heard the strange man's voice again. The Utzis quickly realized that someone was calling for help. Suddenly, John shifted into Marine mode. After rounding up his children, the family set off to find the source of the mysterious voice calling for assistance. Together, they did a call and response, taking them further and further from the trail. Without phone service, the Utzis were this man's only hope. After 20 minutes of shouting, John and his children stumbled upon a clearing. They had climbed down 600 yards of a steep trail leading them to a creek. That's where John spotted a silhouette near the water. Once the Utzis approached, John realized it might be too late. He was lying beside a creek, John later told KRQE News. He couldn't stand, he couldn't move, he was delirious, so he wasn't making much sense. John and his kids immediately took out their safety rations, supplying the man with fresh water and food, but things were looking grim. His lips were all chapped to the point they were bleeding, John continued. His tongue was swollen, he was super gaunt and skinny. I was like, this guy really needs help. Without medical professionals on hand, John would have to make a decision fast. Using his marine skills, John figured out the man's coordinates. The Utzis then hiked 3 miles to the trailhead, where they called 911 with the man's location. The authorities thanked John for his help and assured him they wouldn't rest until the man was found. and yet the local news said otherwise. After bringing his kids home, John was glued to the TV news reports of the incident. After 8 hours of searching, the rescue crew had decided to give up. John was not going to let that happen. Early the next morning, he strapped on his boots and hit the trail once more. John retraced his steps, and sure enough, there was the man in the same place the Utsis had left him. John returned to an area with cell service, called 911 again, and led them straight to the creek. When medics finally arrived, they discovered the 50-year-old had been stranded for 14 days. Despite being without food or water for nearly 2 weeks, the crew managed to save the man's life. John and his children were delighted, and although the 50-year-old hiker was quite experienced, it would soon be revealed that he made one crucial mistake which landed him in the dire situation. You guessed it, he went hiking alone. Groups only, folks. Brad Parker, right, learned this the hard way after going for a solo climb to celebrate proposing to his longtime girlfriend. Unfortunately, Brad would face far graver consequences than the man in New Mexico ever did. If you asked Brad Parker's closest friends about him, they would all sing similar praises. He had a gift with people. He was one of the gems everyone would just gravitate to. He was larger than life, and it costed him in the long run. After finishing up high school in 1996, the Santa Rosa, California native traveled the world. He passed through Indonesia, New Zealand, and more, and jumped headfirst into any extreme sport he could find. In his 30s, he catapulted himself into the upper echelons of rock climbers, earning a cover spot on California Climber magazine in 2012. On the side, he taught yoga. His energy and enthusiasm captivated even those he barely knew. Rock climbers knew him as an awesome climber. Brad's best friend and climbing partner Jerry Dodrill said surfers knew him as an awesome surfer, and yoga instructors knew him as an amazing yoga instructor. Brad's friends, family, and even minor acquaintances were delighted in June 2014 when the 36-year-old let his friends and family on social media know the truth. He was in love with a girl named Janae Dial. Janae managed an online store that sold outdoor adventure products to women, and she faced life with a similar enthusiasm as Brad. In fact, 2 months after Brad's Facebook post, the couple set out for Yosemite National Park. And though Janae didn't know it, the ever-smiling, always excited Brad planned a surprise for her there. He unveiled it on a Saturday morning climb to the summit of Cathedral Peak, a 10,912-foot mountain. Using ropes, the couple ambled upwards for a few hours before reaching the narrow peak of the mountain. There, on a piece of rock just big enough for 2 people to stand on, Brad lowered himself to one knee and asked Janae to marry him. For nearly 40 years, Brad chased every thrill he could find, but chances were his heart never beat harder or faster than in the split-second silence following his proposal. To his delight, Janae said yes. Minutes later, as the two descended the mountain, Brad told her, "This is the happiest day of my life." And though Brad didn't know it, the moment of pure elation that followed the couple's commitment to marriage was the moment his life peaked. Because once they reached the base of the mountain, the climber caught an itch to climb another mountain. So while Janae headed back to camp, Brad hiked to Mathis Crest, a massive ridge just 3 miles away. In hindsight, it wasn't unexpected that Brad left his fiancée to climb again. He'd been training for a major climb he planned for the future. But as he hiked up towards Mathis Crest, other hikers noticed something was off about the man. One of those hikers, Cedric Ma, saw Brad on his way to the crest. He said he was dehydrated and had cramps, Cedric wrote. After that, he continued to solo up the north summit and disappeared from view. Nevertheless, cramped, dehydrated, and likely fatigued from climbing earlier in the day at high altitudes, Brad tackled the vertical face of Mathis Crest. At about 5:45 p.m., hours after his proposal, Brad slipped. Other climbers and hikers in the area watched from afar as the experienced climber and soon-to-be wed man fell 300 feet from the top of the ridge. He hit the rocky ground below with a thud. Then there was silence. The silence was not like the momentary one that followed Brad's proposal to Janae. This was the silence of death, total and deafening. A finite sort of thing, broken only by the park rangers when they hiked in to recover Brad's body. By the time rangers found Brad, it was too late for the helicopter to fly in for extraction. They left him there overnight, and in the morning they removed him from the park. Soon word spread to all of Brad's friends and family. There was little solace to take in Brad's death, but still, as Brad himself would have done, his loved ones turned the meaningless of his demise into something beautiful. They spread his ashes around the California coast and more. As time passed, Brad's friends found more ways to honor their friend. The memorial service for Brad featured a paddle out into the Russian River mouth near Jenner, California. There, Janae and Brad's mother mourned together. And when the wounds healed further, those close to Brad ventured into Yosemite. Together, they climbed Cathedral Peak, the place where Brad enjoyed the happiest moment of his action-packed life. That moment with Janae. It wasn't until later that the pain of the moment didn't sting so deep, that Janae sat down and reflected, recording her thoughts in a 2016 Facebook post. To Brad Parker, she wrote, "It's so bittersweet, so brutal, and yet so precious and true." She continued, "You not only live on in me, but continue to live on in others and give them life. And not only life, but that great consciousness of life that reminds us what truly matters. You continue to give me life, and what an awful, stinging irony that is."